Hello everyone, this is Lam here. In today's video, we're going to be looking at a basic starter guide to the Canon R6. So the first thing that you want to do when you get your camera is you want to get out your charger and your battery, and you want to go ahead and charge your battery up to full before you start playing around with your camera, because it is important to get a good first cycle on your battery just for longevity's sakes. Once you have that out of the way, you can go ahead and start assembling your camera. So on the Canon R6, to remove the front cap, what you want to do is you just want to twist it counterclockwise, and then you can just take it right off. You don't have to push any buttons in order to do that. Then you have your lens itself, and again, what you want to do is you want to go ahead and twist it counterclockwise. Now, a lot of people have told me to actually cover this, but you can actually just twist these two together, and it actually makes a nice compartment for, say, something like an SD card, because it is so large. So something for you to think about if you want to carry this around with you. So now that you have both the caps off, what you want to do is you want to look for the red marker on the lens, and you want to look for the red marker which is right at the top of the ring, and you want to line these two red markers up. And once you have it nicely snug, you can go ahead and just twist it counterclockwise until you hear a click, and then it will be seated very nicely. The red mark should be somewhere right around here if you can see it. There is a button right here which you can press to actually release the lens again. So if you go ahead and push in the button and then you twist it, you can go ahead and remove the lens again. But we're going to go ahead and just seat this lens for our tutorial. The next thing you want to do after that is you want to go ahead and put in your battery once it's fully charged. So go ahead, open up the battery compartment, and from here you want to have these leads going into the camera like this. It should slide in very easily. If you get any resistance, then you definitely want to make sure that you're putting in your battery correctly, but go ahead and push it in. The white latch should be able to lock in place, keeping it firmly seated, and then you can go ahead and close the lid. The last thing that we're going to do is go ahead and insert the SD card, and we'll talk a little bit about the SD cards here in a second, but you can go ahead, open it up. There are going to be two slots. The one slot that's further to the back, that's slot 1, and the one that's a little bit closer to the front is slot 2. You can use any slot if you're going to be using just one SD card, but go ahead, push it in, and close the door, and your camera is good to go. A lot of people just reuse their old SD cards, but for a lot of these new cameras, you do want to get new SD cards, and these are kind of the newest versions of the SD cards. If I had money to spare, I would definitely recommend buying the SDXC version, which is the latest version, the latest format. It starts at 64 gigabytes, and what you're looking for is a V90, which will allow you to do the 300 megabytes read and write. So these are really nice cards, but they are also very expensive. Now, if you don't want to spend as much, you can grab the 32 gigabyte version, which is the SDHC version. So this is the previous generation's SD cards. And most likely what you want to do is you want to grab the 32 gigabyte version. And again, you're looking for that 300 megabytes read and write. A lot of the really good video features is going to require very fast SD cards. And also in general, in order to clear your buffer when you're taking a lot of pictures all at once, you really do want a very fast SD card transfer. So these new cards will allow for that. Now that we have the camera set up, what we can go ahead and do is we can open this up, flip over the screen so that we can see the screen, and we can go ahead and turn on our camera for the first time. As you can see, I laid out a few things on the table just so that we can play with focus a little bit later. But the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to go into the menu system, and we're going to do two very important things before we start setting up our camera. You can go ahead and use this knob up top here to flip through the major menu screens, or you can just go ahead and touch it. But what we want to do is we want to go ahead and format the card. So you can use this wheel right here to go back and forth within the sub menu, and we want to select format. We're going to choose SD card 1, and then we're going to use the wheel again, and we're going to go ahead and format the SD card to ensure that it's good to go. The second thing that we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and we're going to go through the menu system, and you can use this joystick up top to go through the submenus. So the knob up here is to go through the major ones, and then the subfolders, you can use the knob to go through all of them. But what we're going to be looking for is the firmware. If you select that, it's going to tell you the camera firmware and the lens firmware. Now, I know for a fact that we do have a new firmware version for the camera. I'm not sure about the lens, but we're going to go ahead and check those on Canon's website, and we're going to download it to the SD card so that we can go ahead, select in here and update the firmware. Alright, so we are on Canon's website, and as you can see, I already pulled up the Canon R6. And right here, you can go to drivers and downloads. So down here, you can definitely see firmware, and you can see that we have version 1.1.1, which is newer. So we're going to go ahead, select that, and we're going to download it, and then we're going to put it onto our SD card. Now, as for the RF24-105, which is what we're using, if you scroll down, you'll notice that there is no firmware tab, so there is no new firmware for this. So we're just going to go ahead and download the 1.1.1, and we're going to put it on our SD card. So I've opened up the SD card, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to drag it right onto the SD card, and then we're going to go ahead and put that back into the camera. So the firmware is now onto the SD card. We're going to go ahead, put it back into the camera. We're going to go ahead, turn on the camera again. Going to go into the menu screen. Going to go into firmware, and we're going to go ahead and update to version 1.1.1. So we're going to hit OK and let the camera work on it. Now it's going to ask me to go ahead, select the firmware version, and we're going to select OK again, and it's going to go ahead and start the upgrade process. I went ahead and I just cut to the very end because this process can take a while. This is the reason why it's really important to have a full battery charge, because you definitely don't want anything happening during this process. And again, just be patient, but once it's done, you'll see this menu screen. You can go ahead and hit OK, or you can just hit the set button. And then what you want to do is you want to just go ahead, shut off your camera, and then you want to turn it back on to recheck the firmware version. So we're going to go ahead, hit the menu button again, and as you can see, the camera body is now on version 1.1.1. Now that we know we have the latest firmware on the camera, we can go ahead and start talking about the camera operations from a beginner's perspective. So we're going to go ahead, turn on our camera, and what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and talk about the shutter button. So the shutter button, when you half press it, it's going to go ahead and start trying to grab focus. Now what you'll notice when you actually grab focus down here is that there's a bunch of green boxes telling you what's in focus. When you first start in program mode, the camera is going to try to figure out what you want in focus. If you don't like that, what you can do is you can go ahead and actually just touch the screen and tell it what you want in focus. And once again, when you half press, it'll refocus. And then if you push down all the way, it'll go ahead and take that picture. Now, when the focus box turns into this type of box, what it's trying to tell you is that it's actually going to be tracking the subject. So if I were to move this around, what you'll notice is that it'll try to go ahead and track the tripod. Again, if you actually see this type of box, it's going into tracking mode. So if I were to move this object around, it'll continue to track that. One thing that you do want to notice is that as I move it around, this is actually not in focus. You actually have to half press the shutter button again to get it in focus. So you can go ahead, half press the shutter button, and then take a picture of that in focus. When it's actually doing the tracking, it's not doing continuous autofocus. So that's something that you have to be aware of. You want to half press, it'll get focus, and then you can take a sharp picture. Now, if you want to stop focus tracking, you can just go ahead, hit the set button, and that'll go away. Now, this type of focusing method is very useful if you're going to be using the back of the screen, but if you're going to be using the viewfinder, it's going to be significantly harder to do. So sometimes you do want to use different type of focus mode. So this is where this button comes into play. If you were to select this button, what you get is a bunch of different options for different types of focusing method. Right now we are in tracking mode. You can go ahead and select soft AF. You can go ahead and select single point, expanded AF, there's multi, then there's a big zone mode, there's a vertical zone mode, and then there is a large zone mode, and then of course you can go into manual focus. What I'm going to do is I'm going to concentrate on the single point AF because I think it's one of the more useful ones. When you select single point, you would think that you can use the joystick to move around. That's something that you're actually going to have to turn on. So what you want to do is you want to go ahead, hit the menu button, you want to go over to the camera icon, and what you want to do is you want to go ahead and go over to the buttons and dials customization right here, and what you want to do is you want to go all the way to the bottom, and right here it says multi-control. If you were to select that, you can go ahead and use direct AF points or turn on direct AF points, and then from now on you can actually use your joystick to move around the focus box. You can also still use the touch to focus while in this mode. So I feel like this is kind of the best of both worlds. The only thing that you're going to be losing in single point focus is that you're going to be losing the tracking element. So again, if you want to go ahead and use the tracking element, what you need to do is you need to go ahead and select tracking so that when you touch something, it will try to track that object. Now, if you don't need that, then I think the next best one is single point autofocus, because it allows you to move around the box. You can go ahead and touch, and when you use the viewfinder, you can use your joystick to move things around. Definitely play around with both those modes, and there are also a bunch of different modes that you might want to try, but it's really important to understand how to use the different types of focusing on your camera systems. There's definitely a lot of them in here, so you definitely want to get used to using this button and trying all of the different focus modes. Now, we've already talked about the joystick and how to actually make the joystick useful. The next button right over to it is called AF on, and what this allows you to do is it allows you to turn on the focusing system without actually having to use the shutter button. This is something a lot of photographers like to use. It's called back button focus, and there's a lot of reasons to do it. I encourage you to go ahead and search on YouTube videos for back button focus to see whether or not you want to use it. So the next button that I want to explain is the exposure lock button. It has the asterisk right here, and to explain this one, I'm going to use a simple demo. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and put in this white piece of paper, and as you can see, when I move the white piece of paper in here, it changes the exposure. Now, if I were to select the exposure lock, when I move this piece of paper in here, you'll notice that the exposure does not change because everything is locked off. So this is kind of what we use. One interesting thing about this exposure lock, at least by default, is that it's actually not a permanent lock. In other words, when you actually select this, it only lasts for a certain amount of time, and this is the indicator. It'll actually eventually go away. So you just saw it go away again. So you see the exposure is locked, and then if I introduce the piece of paper, eventually this lock will go away. The asterisk will go away automatically, and then it'll start again adjusting exposure based on the objects in the scene. So it's something that's very useful, but it is also a little bit weird from default in that it is not a permanent lock. Within the custom settings, you can change it to where it's a push to lock, and it'll remain locked until you push the button again. Now, if you go ahead and push the exposure lock, if you want to go ahead and remove it, you can go ahead and select the focus menu and then have pressed on the shutter button to get out of it. Moving down to the next button, this button right here actually doesn't do anything in tracking. So if you were to change tracking modes and select, say, single point, and then you were to select it, now you can actually magnify in to see if you have really good focus. The next button below it is the info button. If you were to select the info button, what it does is it actually turns on different types of information on your back screen. So as you cycle through all of the different screens, you can see what is or is not displayed on them. And eventually it'll get you back to the original screen right after this one right here. The Q button is for the quick menu. This turns on all of the different types of settings that you can actually play with. And I would recommend you come in here and try out the different settings. All of the focus modes are on the bottom, but for the purposes of this video, we're really not going to go into the quick menu button because you can spend a lot of time in here. Now, if you're in single point focus, if you hit the set button, the autofocus box will go ahead and go back to the center. So again, if you were to move it around and then you hit the set button, it'll reset it to the center. So this is something that's very useful. Now, if you were to go back to tracking and then you were to touch the focus and start tracking, the set button will actually just reset the tracking. So it does different things, but definitely check out what the set button does for the different types of focus modes that you're going to be in. The next button to talk about is the menu button. This, of course, will get you into the menu system, and the menu system is touch enabled. So once you get into the menu system, you can definitely touch it, or you can use this knob up top to go in the major screens. The joystick will give you into the sub screens, and then the dial itself will go into the specific settings. So there's definitely a lot of features in here to talk about. We're going to go ahead and save that for episode 2 of this tutorial series. The next set of buttons to talk about, you'll notice that these buttons are actually colored in blue. That's because they're actually supposed to be used in conjunction with each other. So if you were to hit the play button, this will show you pictures that you've already taken or movies that you've already taken. If you select the rate button, you can actually give it 1 to 5 stars, or you can give it no stars. So this is somebody who wants to go through their pictures while in camera and be able to rate their pictures so that later on when they export it out, they can say, I only want the 5-star ratings or the 4-star ratings. There's also a trash can down here in which you can actually go ahead and delete the photos. If you were to turn the color wheel, what you can see is it'll actually go ahead and scroll through all of the pictures that we have taken so far. If you were to use this knob up top, you can actually zoom in or zoom out to see your pictures. You can actually zoom into the picture, or if you actually were to go all the way out, you can actually see how many photos that you have recorded so far. So very useful things that actually sort through all of the content that you've been getting. The last dial to talk about is the actual wheel itself. Now, if you have something that you have in focus, what you can do is you can actually use this wheel to change the exposure compensation. So as you can see, when I move the wheel to the right, the whole scene itself gets brighter. And when I actually move it to the left, the entire scene gets darker. So exposure compensation, especially in program mode, can be very useful because it can allow you to adjust the lighting without having to manually adjust the aperture and the shutter speed. So exposure compensation is definitely something that you do want to take a look at. One thing to note is that you do need to have something in focus first, and then you can change the exposure compensation. Now let's go ahead and talk about the buttons and dials on top of the camera, and there is some very interesting functionality up here, but I'm going to try to keep it short. We've already talked about the program mode in which you can go ahead and select different modes on the camera. We're just going to stick with P mode for this particular tutorial because it's the easiest one to talk about, but in future videos we can talk about the different modes that this actually goes into. Over here, the back dial, this one right here actually controls the ISO. So if you notice on the screen here, I can go from auto ISO to just actually selecting my own ISO. So it can be useful, but generally speaking, in program mode, you just do want to keep it in auto ISO. I wouldn't recommend playing with this one too much. There is a lock button, so if you hit the lock button, it'll actually disable some of the dials so that you don't accidentally change things. There is a lock icon. Now if I were to actually turn this dial, you'll notice the ISO will not change. If I were to unlock it, I can once again change the ISO. If I were to lock it, I no longer can change the ISO. So the lock button can be very useful if you just want to go ahead and make sure you don't accidentally use one of these dials and get out of auto mode. The record button, this allows you to go ahead and start recording video. You'll notice down here it says you can actually change exposure compensation. So you can use the dial on the back of the camera to change exposure compensation, which is actually very useful because a lot of times what I've noticed is that you do want to brighten up the scene just a little bit. Keep in mind on default settings, this is most likely recording in 1080p. You do want to dive into the menu settings if you want to record 4K by default. Here is the front command dial, and when you actually move it around in P mode, it doesn't do anything. What you need to do is you need to use it in conjunction with this function button. And this function button actually does a lot of things. I'm just going to go through it in general, but if you were to select it, you'll notice that it actually brings up another submenu. Now, if you use the front command dial, you can go ahead and select specific settings within this selected menu. So right now, it's on ISO. So if I were to use the front dial, I can select a specific ISO. If you were to use the wheel in the back, you can actually select other different sub modes. And again, you can use the front command dial to select something. So for instance, I can go ahead and select multi-shot. So now, if I were to hold down the shutter button, it will take multiple pictures. But for this specific video, I'm just not going to dive deep into it because it would be a very long video if I were to do that. If you do have any questions about any of these buttons, definitely leave it in the comments below and I'll do my best to go ahead and answer them. But this should be a really good start and we can dive into some of the more deeper features in later videos. Hopefully this helped you out. Thank you so much for watching. If you have any questions, leave it in the comments below and I'll see you in the next video.